Good morning and welcome to your Champs Club meeting. For those of you who do not recognize my face, I'm Marie Campion. I'm the district manager for the South Metro office, and today's Champs Club is all about phoning. So the most glamorous part of the job. So I know when you guys hear phoning, you probably have one of two responses. It's either, oh my gosh, I love making phone calls and talking to people. It's a very small amount of the population. And then a lot of people are like, oh, phone calls. That's the part of the job that feels kind of like work, right? What I'm going to be covering today is basically going to just help your phoning be a lot smoother. Make sure that you have kind of the right objectives in mind, and also make your phone calls more effective so you're booking more demos. So today there's kind of two things I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about like what you can do on the phone call to make sure that they go the way that you want. And then I'm also going to be talking to you about what are the things that you want to do during a phone session to make it as effective and as productive as possible. So things that are happening outside of the actual phone call with your customer that are going to make a big difference. So let's start with that, okay? So when you are making phone calls, you want to make sure that you are creating a situation that's as conducive to you hitting your goals as possible. So there's a couple different things that you want to be aware of. The first thing I would say is anytime you're making phone calls, make sure you have goals in mind of how you want that phoning session to go. So what I mean by that is you don't want to just be thinking about oh, I'm just going to sit here for 30 minutes and make calls. Like way too many people do that where they're like, I'm going to sit down for an hour and make calls. And that's like as far as they get. They start making phone calls. They don't really phone with any kind of direction. And I'm assuming you guys would agree, right? Anytime that you do anything where you have objectives in mind beforehand, you work harder to accomplish it, right? So when you're phoning, you want to have two different kinds of goals, okay? So one is an activity goal. So that just has to do with how hard you're working during that time, right? And then you also want to have a productivity goal. So productivity versus activity. Productivity is more about what are you accomplishing during that time, right? How efficient are you being? How productive are you being? So activity goal is basically just going to be a commitment to how many phone calls you're going to make during your phoning time, right? So, how active are you going to be? If you're trying to come up with what you think your phoning or your call goal should be, just so you kind of know what the ranges are, you want to be making at least 20 to 30 calls per hour. If you find in an hour you're making over 30 calls, awesome, that's great. I always kind of tried to do a contest with myself of I'm going to try to see if I can beat how many calls I did the hour before. That's awesome. But if you're just sitting down and make phone calls for an hour and you're wondering what is a good amount of calls? How do I know that I'm doing a good job and that I'm getting enough done? It's 20 to 30 calls per hour. So if you're only sitting down and making calls for 30 minutes, you want to be probably making at least 10 to 15 calls, right? So make sure you have a number of how many calls you want to make. Second thing is that productivity goal, right? So productivity, again, is probably the more important of the two, solely just because you can make calls all day, but if you don't book anyone, your job's not really done, right? So that being said, productivity is just how many you want to set during the time that you're spending on the phone. So, obviously that number is going to be different depending on, if you're working largely with your initial list still, I'd say you could probably set 3 to 4 per hour, sometimes more, right? Some of you guys might remember from training, you booked in the 45 minutes you had in training, you booked 5 or 6, which is awesome. If you're working largely through referrals, we want to say probably 2 to 3 per hour is what you should be shooting for. 2 is always a pretty good conservative goal. So always have those two goals, write them down before you even start your calls. What's great about having both of them, and the reason you want to have both, is because with your activity goal, you can 100% control that, right? So you might not be able to control how many people answer the phone, right? Or even maybe necessarily how many you get booked up. However, the second part of what I'm going to talk about today is to help you, control a lot of that. But you can always 100% control how many calls you make, right, when you sit down. So that goal is great because it gives you that feeling of accomplishment, even if your productivity goal doesn't get hit. If you, set a goal of setting 2 in an hour and you only set the 1, you can at least walk away knowing hey, you know what? I committed to making 35 calls. I sat down and I made 35 calls and I feel good about that, right? So that's why it's important to have an activity goal. And then obviously, like I said earlier, the productivity goal is important because, how many demos you have is money in your pocket, right? So have the goals. Second thing is making sure that you're in a place that's conducive to you doing phone calls without a lot of distraction, right? So you want to make sure you have like the right stuff in front of you, which is your phoning approach, right? And then your call tracker, which I'm going to talk about in a minute here. But it's also about making sure you don't have stuff in front of you that's going to be really distracting. So, so like we all know what it's like to sit down and make phone calls, and then all of a sudden you're like in a deep dive on Facebook, or you're, watching Netflix or something like that, right? So make sure that when you're doing phone calls, you're in a good spot. You're in a quiet place without a lot of background noise. You want to have you don't want to have TV on in the background or something like that that's going to distract you from making calls, because then all of a sudden those 30 calls you were supposed to make in an hour becomes 30 calls over like 2.5 hours. And so you want to make sure that like you're not being distracted by that stuff. Also, is important when you're on the phone with a customer that they aren't like hearing a bunch of stuff in the background and trying to like understand what you're saying over it, right? So make sure you're in a quiet spot so they can hear you, you can hear them, but you're also not getting distracted. And then the third thing, and I just mentioned this, is making sure you have a call tracker. Call trackers are really important because it helps you understand like how effective you're being on the phone, and also how hard you're working and how like effectively you're utilizing your time. So when you have a call tracker, what you're putting on the call tracker is you're going to divide it out by each hour that you're doing calls. And then next to each hour, so if, let's say it's like 2 to 3 p.m., you're going to have 3 columns that you put tallies in. So the first one's going to be calls, right? So anytime you make a call, you're going to tally it. The second column is reached. So anytime you make a call, you'll tally that one. If you reach the person, they actually pick up, you're going to tally the second column as well, right, for reached. And then the third column is set. So if you call someone, you reach them, and you set them, you get to mark all 3 categories, right? So what this helps with is, one, helps you like stay on track for how many calls you want to make, right? Because if you're tracking how many calls you've done, you're not like just guessing if you made a certain number of calls. You can actually see how many you've made for the hour, so you can see if you're like on pace for what you wanted to accomplish. And then also, it also allows you to like see how many people you're reaching when you make calls, and then also how many you're setting from how many you reach. This is important, you guys, because it's one of our favorite things to do as people, where we make up almost kind of like stories of what's happening, right? So what I mean by that is like, we've probably all been that person before where we're making calls and we say the beautiful line of nobody's answering, right? Nobody's answering. But the thing is like a lot of times when we say that, we can look at our call and say like, oh, I've actually just called like 4 people. So it's not that nobody is answering, right? It's just I've made my first four calls and no one's answered yet, and I don't feel good about it, right? So it also allows you at the end of the hour, instead of saying like, oh, no one really answered, to look and say, oh, actually, I called 25 people this hour, 7 answered, and I only booked 1 or 2 of them. So it's actually not that no one is answering. I had 7 people pick up the phone, right? But I only scheduled 1 or 2. So maybe that means that there's something I could be doing better on the calls, so that I'm scheduling more of the people I'm talking to. So when you have that like data and that evidence to tell you the story of what's going on, it allows you to eliminate maybe the story you're telling yourself in your head, and work in logic and fact-based information, right? So having the call tracker is really important, not only so you stay on track, but you can see how effective you're being and help diagnose maybe areas of opportunity. It also helps show you areas where you might be doing really well. So if you reach 7 people and you set 7 of them, you're like, wow, I'm a badass, right? So have the call tracker. Now, the rest of the stuff I'm going to cover is really just stuff that you want to be super focused on when you're actually on the phone with a customer, okay? So these are the things that are really important. There's going to be, let me see, I wrote some notes down on this, so I'm going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there's 5 things on the phone that you want to be really focused on. The number one thing, and if you guys are taking notes right now, which I hope you are, the first one you want to write in all caps, which is follow the manual, okay? Following the manual on your phone call is just as important as it is following the manual in your demo. In the phone approach, if you're not following the manual and you're just winging it, you are definitely adding stuff in that you shouldn't, or taking things out that are important. And what you're doing ultimately is probably confusing the customer, because you're not really giving them a clear understanding of what the appointment is, how it works, what it entails. And so you really want to make sure that you are focused on reading the manual so that they're getting the exact right amount of information, right? So for example, when someone adds in way too much info, like I've heard new reps on the phone before where they are not following the manual, they're winging it, and they're super excited, so they're just sharing all this information about Cutco, all this other stuff that like to the customer is just a little bit confusing and overwhelming. Remember, you guys, like your objective in the call is just to schedule the appointment. Like Cutco is awesome, but they're not going to understand how awesome it is until they actually get to see it in person. So make sure you're just focusing on scheduling the appointment. And then again, same thing with like, you don't want to eliminate information as well. So there are important things in the phone script that need to be said. And again, if you're not following it, you're not getting those things. And the last thing I'll say with following the script is just when you follow the script, you don't have to focus on what you're saying. You get to focus on how you're saying what you're saying, right? So in communication, I think it's about 65% of communication is nonverbal. So it's like physical cues that your body is giving, that kind of thing. About 30% of it is, how you sound, like how you're saying what you're saying, your tone. And then the rest is like, obviously like the words coming out of your mouth, right? On the phone, you don't have any body language to rely on. So like your tone becomes really important. When you're trying to remember like what it is that you're even supposed to say to the customer, you're not focusing on your tone or your delivery or how well you're connecting with that person. And it really affects your confidence. So when you're able to focus on solely how you're saying what you're saying, you sound way more confident. When you're confident, the customer is confident and comfortable as well, because they're really going to mirror exactly what your tone and your confidence level is. So that's my last little nugget with following the approach is like, do it because it's the right thing to do. It gives them the right information at the appropriate time and place. But 2, it gives you more confidence, which means that the call is always going to go well. All right, so that's following the script. Second thing is building rapport. So building rapport is really important, just like in a demo, because you guys, the phone call really sets the tone for what the demo or the appointment is actually going to be like, right? So one little nugget I'll say for building rapport actually starts before the phone call. It starts when you're getting the recommendations. Always try to make sure you get as much information as possible from the customer on who you're calling. So that way, when you call the customer, you already have something that you can build rapport with them on. So for example, if I call Mrs. Jones because Mrs. Smith recommended me to her, if I ask Miss Smith a lot of questions, I'm going to be able to call Mrs. Jones and say, hey, Mrs. Jones, I was sitting down with Mrs. Smith. She gave me your number because she thought you might be nice enough to help me out with something I'm working on. She said you guys actually know each other from book club. That's awesome. How long have you guys been doing that together, right? And you can kind of talk about those things. And awesome, she said you had kids attending this school. That's great. I used to go there. I have a lot of, family members or friends that go there, right? Whatever it is that they share with you, like you can utilize that and implement it in your call so that right off the bat, they don't feel like there's some random person you got recommended to. Like they feel like, okay, this person like already knows a fair amount about me, and they're interested in getting to know me more, right? So that's a really big thing. Ask them questions. So understand that you don't need to know information about them to build rapport. If you weren't able to get a lot of information on them in the referral process, always still ask them questions. Hey, how is your day going, right? If it's a Thursday or Friday, do you guys have any exciting plans for this weekend, right? If 4th of July or Memorial Day or Labor Day is coming up, it's like, okay, cool. Do you have any exciting plans for the holiday, right? But make sure that like you're asking questions to get to know them a little bit better. If you can try to at least connect with even just one thing on the call, it makes them excited for when you come over. And so, they're going to show up to that appointment the right way and excited to see you, which is awesome. Last thing I'll tell you with building rapport is, and this it's not necessarily building rapport, but it relates to that because it's about building their comfort level, is telling jokes. Ask your manager or some like lead representatives in the office, like what are the funny jokes you tell on the phone that make the customer feel more comfortable? Some of my favorites are if they ask you what you're selling, saying like, oh, I'm selling baby alligators, Mrs. Jones, the kids love them, right? And then they'll be like, what? And so you can kind of laugh about that. Or one of my other favorite ones is like if they ask you, what are you selling? Oh, inflatable dartboards. They're one-time use only though, right? Another great one, if they ask you, how long is the demo? Mrs. Jones, it's pretty quick. It's only about like 7 or 8 hours. So I'll bring a sleeping bag. I've got a tent for out back. And all I need is just for you to make me some breakfast in the morning. We'll be all set, right? And then letting you know, I'm just kidding, Mrs. Jones. My part's only about, 30 to 45 minutes. And after that, it's up to you, right? So it's like having those jokes, like it just like lightens the mood, makes it more fun, which is ultimately, what you want. Okay, so that's building rapport. Third thing is be ready to handle schedule objections. You guys have to remember that, like, to you, this appointment is a lot more important than it is to the customer, right? So it's not uncommon, especially when you start working more and more with referrals, for them to kind of give you the whole, like, oh, we're really busy. We've got this, that, and the other thing going on. You guys, that's everybody. Everybody has important stuff going on in life. Like, this is a number 25 on the list of things that are important for Mr. and Mrs. Jones to do in their given week. So be ready to handle that. If you are on the phone with someone, they give you an objection, and you're like, oh, no problem, I'll call you another time. It's really hard to schedule those people. Understand that your likelihood of scheduling someone is so much higher when you schedule them the first time you're on the phone with them than if you have to, like, call them back or whatever, right? So make sure that, like, when they do tell you that they're busy, or when they tell you, oh, we already have, we already have knives at home, or maybe it's, I already have Cutco, right? Make sure you're ready to handle those things, letting them know, like, hey, you already own Cutco? That's awesome. How do you like it? Great. Well, hey, you'll probably be able to give me some awesome pointers. Like I said, you don't have to buy anything. So I'd love to get, your feedback, especially since you've seen the presentation before, right? Or if it's, hey, we already have kitchen stuff. No problem. I know you already have tons of knives. I get paid just to show it. Every appointment helps me towards my scholarship. Or whether it's, yeah, we're really busy. Hey, I totally get it, Mrs. Jones. I'm really busy as well. I can make sure to keep it short. Is that a bad day or just a bad time? Like, being ready to handle that stuff. If you act like it's no big deal when they give you that response and you handle it smoothly, it's not going to be a big deal to them either. So just make sure that you're ready to handle those objections and that you're not immediately, going for a callback or something when you could probably just, like, ask them a follow-up question to find a time that would work better, right? So handle those schedule objections. Next thing is building urgency. This kind of goes into what I was saying earlier, where it's like, this appointment is a lot more important to you than it is to them. So having a sense of urgency when you call is super, super helpful in terms of getting them scheduled for a definitive time to do your appointment. So with the building urgency, how you can do this is by making sure when you make calls, you have a goal of how many appointments you want to do within the next 3-day window, okay? So let's say I'm making calls on a Friday, right? It means I want to have a goal that I want to complete Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So by Sunday night, right, you want to have a goal of how many you want to complete that you're sharing with the customer over the phone. So let's say it's Friday night or Friday morning, I'm making calls and I want to book the rest of my Friday through Sunday. Let's say I want to book 8. When I'm on the phone with the customer, I want to let them know, hey, Mrs. Jones, I'm working really hard. I've got, until Sunday night to get 8 appointments completed, and I'm at 5. Is there any way you can squeeze me in on Saturday at either 10 a.m. or 12 p.m., right? Which would work better for you? It's letting them know, like, hey, I've got this much I'm looking to complete in a shorter window, and I'm this close. Is there any way you could help me? They're much more inclined to say, like, yeah, let's do this time or this time, or, oh, that time doesn't work, and you can say, no problem, is this or this better for you? But when it's just, like, open-ended and they have no idea, like, what you're trying to accomplish, it's less urgent for them too, right? Because it's always less urgent than it is for you to them. So make sure that, like, you know what your goal is within your next 3-day window and that you're utilizing that to help you get the appointment booked right away versus, again, an appointment booked further out, or one that ends up not even getting booked and is a callback for later. Because also remember, you guys, with your appointments, booking them within 2 to 3 days, like, that person is a lot less likely to forget about your appointment. Stuff is a lot less likely to come up. The bigger that window is between the phone call and the appointment, the more likely it is that your customer will have something that does come up, or they forget about it, or they need to reschedule, right? And so you're also protecting that as well, and a higher completion efficiency on the other end. So that's building urgency. Last thing is firming up properly. I feel like the last 2 or 3 lines of that appointment, or like the phone approach, is the ones that are, like, the most slept on. Like, here's the thing, you guys, like, you can do all this work to get them set up for an appointment, but if they say, like, oh, this time works for me, you're like, okay, great, what's your address? Awesome, see you then. You're missing an opportunity to firm up the appointment so that they don't cancel or reschedule later on, and they understand, like, how the process works. So making sure you let the customer know that, like, hey, I've got you my schedule for this time. Just so you know, if something comes up and you have to reschedule, I don't get paid for the time slot. So are you sure this time definitely works for you? Those lines allow the customer to understand, like, oh, I should make sure that this time is a good time, because the only way they get paid is if they actually complete the appointment. You guys, letting them know that is not pushy or aggressive. It's actually being courteous to them, because put yourself in their shoes. If you, like, ended up rescheduling or canceling because you found something else you wanted to do, you'd probably feel bad if you did that not knowing that they don't get paid now, right? So like let them in on it. Make sure you're really transparent and letting them know that like, hey, I get paid for every appointment I complete. And that way, like, they're going to for sure choose a time that works well in their schedule. And then there's going to be a lot less opportunity for them to cancel or reschedule later on. So if you are someone, by the way, where you get a lot of cancels and reschedules, make sure that it's not because you're not using these lines. Because I can tell you from experience, and your manager can tell you from experience, that when you're not utilizing that firm up, those things happen a little bit more frequently. So you want to try to eliminate that as much as possible. Last thing I'll mention with firm up is a really great like little nugget you can have to helping for them to remember your appointment is actually getting directions from them. So we know you guys are going to like use your GPS, right? And that's like how everybody finds where they're going now. But at the same time, when you ask them like, hey, Mrs. Jones, what are some landmarks or some things I should look for when I'm getting close to your house, just so I know that I'm finding it okay, or that I know I'm knocking on the right door? Make sure that like you ask that, so that way they get to think about like, okay, here's what this person's going to be seeing as they come to my house. Because the thing is even though you know you're going to look it up via GPS, when they're walking through the directions, they're literally picturing you driving to their home and the turns and twists you're going to make to get to their front door. So what that does is it actually helps solidify it in their memory, and again makes it a lot easier for them to remember that appointment, even if they have a hectic day or something that comes up in between. Again, they picture you coming, and they're going to remember that as well. So again, little nugget, just get those directions, those landmarks, even if you're not thinking you'll use them. It's really helpful for the customer. Now, again, you guys, the things I mentioned for the call, just to recap for you, make sure you're following the approach. That's number one. Second is building a rapport. Third thing is handling any schedule objections. Fourth thing is building that urgency. And then again, last but not least, make sure you're firming up properly. My little bonus tip, make sure you smile while you dial, right? Again, your appointments, they actually start on the phone, on the initial call. So make it a good one so that they're excited for you to come and that they're excited to sit down with you and help you out. And again, it really does make a difference when they know that the person who shows up at their door is going to be the same awesome person that they talk to over the phone. So bring the energy, bring the focus, and happy phone calls. Have a good rest of your morning, guys.